The golden dog came out of the fog like a ghost from memory, mud on his paws, eyes too human, and clenched between his teeth was a jacket everyone had stopped believing they'd ever see again. Grace didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply opened the door, as if her heart had been waiting for this exact moment, and the wind carried the past back into her life, stitched in old fabric and silent faith. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Granite Bluff, Colorado, winter morning, light snowfall. The town of Granite Bluff woke slowly beneath a pale gray sky, its streets dusted with snow so light it whispered against the rooftops and melted on the windows before anyone could see it settle. The wind carried a hush through the pine-covered slopes surrounding the town, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. At the edge of town, on a winding road that led to nowhere in particular, sat a weathered two-story house with green shutters and a sagging porch. It belonged to Grace Thompson. Grace, 63, was a retired geology teacher whose quiet demeanor hid the sort of woman forged by loss and solitude, slender and tall, with streaks of silver running through her once auburn hair. Grace moved with a kind of cautious precision. She had the gait of someone used to hiking mountain trails, and the silence of someone who talked more with stones than people in recent years, after her husband, Jack, vanished during a solo expedition in the nearby wilderness. Grace had folded inward, not bitter, but gentled by grief. Mornings had grown into rituals. 1 pot of coffee, 2 cups, though one always remained untouched. This morning was like any other, until it wasn't. Grace had just poured the first cup when she spotted the shape at the edge of the porch through the frosted window. A dog. Large, golden. He wasn't pacing or barking, just standing, watching. When she opened the door, the cold bit her skin. But what froze her wasn't the wind, it was what hung from the dog's mouth. A thick, weather-worn jacket, blue with faded orange seams. The fabric was crusted at the hem with old mud and pine needles. Grace's knees nearly gave. She knew that jacket, Jack's jacket. The same one he had been wearing the morning he vanished 4 years ago. The dog didn't move. His eyes were a deep honey brown. Too expressive for comfort. Grace could swear he was waiting for her to speak. She stepped out barefoot onto the snowy wood planks, her coffee forgotten on the sill, cooling quickly. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice catching. The golden retriever took 1 slow step forward, then another, until he was close enough for her to see the burrs tangled in his fur and the raw pads of his paws. He looked around 5 or 6 years old, but his movements were measured, like an old soul in a young body. He released the jacket gently at her feet and sat, his tail brushing the snow behind him. Grace knelt, her trembling fingers lifting the familiar garment as she turned the collar in her hands. A folded scrap of paper fell from the chest pocket, water-stained and nearly falling apart at the folds. It bore Jack's handwriting. "Grace, if you're reading this, I'm in trouble, found something deeper than expected. GPS failing, love you always," that was all. The bottom was too smudged to read, but her breath hitched at the coordinates scribbled at the top corner. Her porch creaked. From behind the bushes at the fence, a small face peeked out. Jacob. Jacob Ellison was 9 years old, a quiet boy with dark curls and eyes the color of river stones. He lived 2 houses down with his mother, Sarah, and hardly spoke to anyone, diagnosed with autism at a young age. Jacob found comfort in patterns, solitude, and animals, but avoided strangers and sudden change like wildfire, most days. He sat by the window sketching foxes, wolves, or fantastical dogs with wings. Sarah, fiercely protective, discouraged interaction with neighbors. Grace gave him a gentle smile but said nothing. She had learned long ago that forcing conversation with Jacob never worked. The boy stared not at her, but at the golden retriever. His small hand gripped the fence slat, knuckles white. The dog turned, looked at Jacob, and wagged his tail once. Jacob blinked, then disappeared behind the fence. Grace turned back to the dog. "Harvey," she whispered. She had no idea why that name came to her, but it did, full and certain, like remembering a name you once dreamed. Harvey cocked his head at her. Inside. She called the only person she could think of, Nolan Green. Nolan had been the sheriff of Granite Bluff for over 30 years before retiring just last summer, a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s. Nolan had a sharp jaw under his snow-white beard, eyes that missed nothing, and a limp earned from falling through ice during a rescue search long ago. He and Jack had been friends, though not close. But Nolan had never once stopped answering Grace's calls in those first years after Jack vanished. She didn't explain much, just told him to come over. Urgently. He arrived within 15 minutes. Stepping onto the porch in his heavy brown coat and work boots, his eyes went straight to the jacket, now folded on the porch swing, and then to the dog sitting beside it. "Grace," he murmured. "Is that? It's Jack's. No doubt." Her voice was firmer now, controlled. Nolan bent, inspected the fabric, then the collar. "Still smells like cedar oil. He used to treat his gear with it before winter hikes." Grace nodded. "There's a note. His handwriting, coordinates. Says he found something, that he's in trouble." Nolan straightened slowly, frowning. "This coat looks too intact to have been out there 4 years. No mold, no tears, no animal scent. It's like it's been sheltered." Harvey let out a soft chuff, then turned his gaze toward the forested ridge in the distance. "Grace," Nolan said after a moment, "we're going to need a map, and boots, and your compass." Grace nodded, already stepping inside to prepare, and from his own yard, behind his silent fence. Jacob watched the dog, Harvey, and for the first time in weeks. A new sketch began to form in his notebook. It wasn't of a creature from dreams. It was of a golden dog with sad eyes, sitting on a porch, holding a coat full of questions. The sky remained draped in soft gray as the trio stepped into the woods behind Grace's house. The morning snow having shifted to a crisp mist that clung to pine needles and stiffened the air with the scent of earth and ice. Granite Bluff was quiet behind them, muffled by distance and pine. Ahead, the forest opened with cautious indifference, unchanged by time, unmoved by memory. Harvey led the way, his golden fur damp from the melting snow, his movements fluid yet precise, as if he knew exactly where to step. Grace followed close behind, bundled in her old hiking jacket, the same one Jack had given her on their 10th anniversary. Her boots crunched against frozen leaves, her breath fogging in steady clouds. Nolan trailed them both, sturdy and silent, his right hand occasionally brushing the butt of the old sidearm he still carried out of habit more than need. They had been walking for nearly an hour when the trail began to change. The air grew colder, more still. The underbrush thickened, as if nature had grown territorial. Harvey slowed, sniffed the ground, then veered sharply to the right, pushing through a patch of mountain laurel and into a gully. Nolan muttered, "This part isn't on any trail map I've seen." Grace nodded, but said nothing. She was focused on her compass, which had begun to behave erratically, the needle trembling, then spinning, then freezing again, always slightly off from true north, after a few minutes of scrambling down the slope. Harvey stopped at a jagged outcrop of limestone veined with quartz. Tucked into the base of the rock face was a narrow gap no wider than a doorway. Vines covered the entrance like a curtain. Harvey barked once, sharp, urgent, and waited. Nolan pulled back the vines. The opening led into darkness. "There," Grace whispered. "That's where Jack must have gone." Nolan knelt and examined the ground. Fresh tracks. He muttered, but not just animal, boot prints. "And those might be claw marks," Bear Grace asked. Nolan shook his head slowly. "Too narrow. Cougar. Maybe, or something smaller, but not wild. They're too even." They paused, listening. No sound but the wind outside and the distant creak of old trees in the cold. Harvey entered first, tail low but wagging slightly. Grace followed. Then Nolan, flashlight in hand. The tunnel was narrow but not unnatural, like an old mining path widened by time and erosion. Faint scuff marks along the walls suggested tools had been dragged here, about 20 feet in. The passage opened into a low cavern. There, scattered on the stone floor, lay remnants: a torn climbing rope, a rusted tin mug, and a compass, the same make and model Jack used to carry. Grace dropped to her knees beside the items, her fingers trembling. "These are his," she whispered. Nolan scanned the cavern. He was definitely here, but he wasn't alone. He pointed toward the far wall where faint shadows of boot soles lingered in the dust. 2 different sizes, one small, one larger. That's when they heard it. A crack of a branch outside the tunnel, followed by a rustle. Harvey growled low in his throat, turned, and bounded back toward the entrance. "Stay here," Nolan ordered, pulling his flashlight and stepping carefully toward the sound. But before he could reach the entrance, a figure darted into view. It was Jacob. The boy stood wide-eyed, panting, his thin arms wrapped tightly around his chest as if holding in every ounce of bravery. He wore a too large yellow parka and snow boots caked with frost. Jacob Grace breathed, startled. "What? How did you?" "I followed Harvey," the boy said, voice small but clear. I didn't mean to. I think he needed me." It was the first time Grace had ever heard him speak a full sentence to her. Behind them. Nolan groaned. "Great. A kid in the woods during a possible crime scene. We're going to get medals for this." Grace put a hand on Jacob's shoulder, guiding him gently toward the warmth of the cavern. "You're safe here, but we have to be careful." Jacob stared at the torn rope and bent to touch it. Reverently. "He was here," he said. "Your husband." Nolan gave Grace a raised eyebrow, but she didn't question it. "How do you know?" "Jacob. He left something," Jacob said, eyes darting. "I saw something shiny outside the tunnel. I can go get it," before anyone could stop him. Jacob turned and darted back toward the clearing outside. Harvey barked once, then followed. Grace and Nolan rushed after them. When they reached the clearing, Jacob was already kneeling beside a patch of snow, brushing away the layer to reveal a metal casing, dented, but intact, inside, dry and protected, were geological survey maps, each marked with handwritten notes and a bold signature at the corner. Jack Thompson. Nolan read aloud. These weren't made for hiking. He was mapping something. Grace studied the notes. "This formation. These are pressure anomalies, fault lines." He was tracking mineral pressure flux. Jacob sat cross-legged beside Harvey, who now pressed close to the boy's side, tail thumping softly. "You shouldn't be here," Nolan said, but his tone was more resigned than reprimanding. Grace glanced at him. He's already here. And honestly, I don't think we would have found that container without him. They stayed there in the clearing for another hour, waiting for the light to shift, for the next signal, for whatever would come next. Nolan radioed in a request for backup and a search team. Grace sketched the outline of the cavern in her notebook while Jacob drew quietly beside her, his fingers blackened by the charcoal pencil he always carried. At one point, he looked up and said, "I think Harvey knew Jack." Grace smiled faintly. "I think you might be right." The tunnel seemed to swallow sound the deeper they went. Only the rhythmic shuffle of boots on stone and the soft panting of Harvey filled the air. Muffled by the cool breath of the mountain, Grace's flashlight beam swept across jagged walls veined with mica and quartz, each glimmer like a memory trying to break the surface. Behind her, Nolan's footsteps were steady, methodical, beside him. Jacob walked with surprising calmness, one hand resting on Harvey's back like the dog was his tether to reality. They had descended for almost half an hour, following what appeared to be an old shaft, reinforced by timber braces now covered in lichen and rusted nails. The air changed. Colder, metallic, and tinged with something faintly sweet, like decayed roots and iron. Then it happened. From the shadows ahead, a melody rose. It wasn't natural. It wasn't wind through rock. It was music. Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World drifted toward them, soft and crackling, like from an old battery-powered radio. Grace froze mid-step. Her breath caught in her throat. "That's the song," she whispered. "Jack sang it the morning he left. Made fun of my dancing while he made eggs." Harvey's ears perked. He tilted his head, then padded forward slowly. Jacob's fingers tightened around Harvey's fur. "It's coming from that way," he said, pointing left at a narrow split in the tunnel. They followed the music, moving with caution. The passage curved tightly, then opened into a small underground chamber. It wasn't natural. Wires ran along the ceiling. Old cables hung loosely from rusted hooks. On one side, a metal desk held geological tools, core samplers, microscopes, rock polishers. A row of half-filled sample trays glistened under the faint glow of a solar-powered lantern. On the wall behind it were photos, pinned maps, mineral composition charts, and a faded snapshot of Grace and Jack in the Smokies, arms wrapped around each other, beaming at the camera. Grace stepped closer. Her fingers traced Jack's handwriting across the charts. Nolan approached a crate labeled lithium silicate, sample B12. "This isn't amateur work." He said, "This is organized. Someone else was here, or still is." Grace replied. The music continued, softer now. They turned toward its source, a small portable radio perched on a rock near the far wall. As Grace reached to turn it off, Harvey growled. A sudden movement from the shadows behind the rock wall. Two figures stepped forward. "Easy," one of them said, hands slightly raised. Both men were in their late 40s, the first, taller and clean-shaven, wore a thick black field jacket and a camo cap pulled low. His face was lined, eyes sharp with the kind of experience earned in desolate places. The second was shorter, wiry, with slicked-back brown hair and a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. His fingers twitched as if used to holding a pencil or a scalpel. "We don't mean you any harm," the tall one said. "Name's Wyatt. This here's Dr. Leo Moran. We're geoscientists, contracted by who Nolan asked," hand slowly drifting near his belt. "Private foundation," Leo said, stepping forward with a toothy, almost oily smile. We're just doing survey work down here, survey work that involves occupying someone else's camp, Grace asked. Leo shrugged. We didn't know anyone else had staked a claim, just stumbled on this site a few months back. Everything looked abandoned. Grace crossed her arms. So, you helped yourselves? Wyatt's voice was calmer. Look, if this is your husband's station, we didn't touch anything. We've just been documenting. He left a lot of work unfinished. Harvey positioned himself between the strangers and Jacob, tail still, muscles tense. The golden fur on his back rippled slightly. Nolan narrowed his eyes. You found it abandoned, but this equipment's recent. Batteries still work, samples fresh, the maps updated, someone's been maintaining it. Leo chuckled nervously. Maybe he's still down here then. Wouldn't that be something? Wyatt shot him a sharp glance. Enough. Something in Wyatt's posture shifted, shoulders tensing ever so slightly, like someone ready for a fight or a lie. Grace stepped to the desk. Why's Jack's photo here if you didn't know who the station belonged to? Wyatt hesitated. We didn't recognize him until we found the ID badge a few days ago. Nolan raised a brow. So you kept the camp intact, but not enough to leave. We needed to keep the samples secure, Leo muttered, eyes darting. At that moment, Harvey turned away from the men and padded toward a break in the far stone wall. A narrow fissure had formed there, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He sniffed once, then whined and sat, pawing at the gap. Grace knelt beside him. Is there something back there? Boy. Jacob moved closer, staring at the crack. I hear something, he said suddenly, a trickle. Grace turned to Wyatt. What's behind there? Nothing, he said too quickly. Just a fault line, too dangerous to enter. But Nolan had already moved. Flashlight aimed into the gap. Then why is there a glow through the crack? Faint light flickered, greenish-white. Unnatural. Leo shifted uncomfortably. We haven't had time to explore that area. Figured we'd leave it for who Grace interrupted. There was a long silence. Finally, Wyatt exhaled. Look, whatever your husband found, it's big. We were hired to recover the data, that's all. But we didn't hurt anyone. Did you see him? Grace asked. Is he alive? Neither man answered. Harvey suddenly let out a low growl, from somewhere in the stone beyond the fissure. There was a sound, soft, rhythmic, unmistakable, tapping. 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 again. Morse code. Grace's heart pounded. Jack Harvey barked once, sharp and insistent. Nolan drew his gun. We're opening this up, now. The moment Grace whispered Jack toward the tapping behind the stone. Something in the air shifted. The stillness fractured, like the mountain itself had paused to listen. Nolan, flashlight in one hand and sidearm drawn in the other, stepped toward the narrow crevice that glowed faintly from within. The Morse rhythm returned. 3 slow taps, then 3 more, not random, not illusion, a message. Wyatt's eyes narrowed. Whatever's behind that wall, you don't want to open it. Grace spun toward him. My husband is behind that wall. Leo took a step forward, arms half raised. Let's not jump to conclusions. But Harvey was done with patience. The golden retriever surged forward with a deep bark, teeth bared, placing himself squarely between Grace and the 2 men. His body was taut, fur bristling with warning. Wyatt's hand twitched toward his belt. Nolan moved faster. Don't, Nolan growled, training his weapon directly on Wyatt's chest. Leo froze. Whoa, whoa, let's calm down. But Harvey lunged, snapping at Wyatt's wrist as the man reached for something tucked behind his jacket. Wyatt stumbled back, cursing, and Leo darted to the side, grabbing the radio on the desk. "Don't you call for help," Grace shouted, before Leo could speak into it. A shrill, piercing sound sliced through the cave. It was a whistle, high-pitched, sharp, echoing off every crystal-veined surface of the chamber. Grace had pulled the emergency whistle from Jack's old jacket and was blowing with every ounce of breath she had. Harvey barked in rhythm. The air felt electrified. Then, to everyone's surprise, another sound joined in, crackling static, then a calm, deliberate voice. "Ranger Unit Echo 5. This is Charlie Control. We received your emergency burst. Units en route. Location triangulated. Everyone froze." The voice had come from Jacob. The boy stood near the sample crates, clutching a compact, military-grade field communicator, its outer shell dusty and dented, its antenna extended. He stared straight at Leo as he spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I told you, I hear things," Jacob said. "I always hear." Sarah, Jacob's mother, had once confided in Grace during a school fundraiser, before the tragedy with her husband changed her. Sarah was a tall, lean woman with an angular face and short dark curls always pulled back. Her husband, a veteran communications officer, had died in a wildfire while helping evacuate trapped hikers. Since then, Sarah had never let Jacob near radios or open trails. The communicator, it seemed, was Jacob's secret link to the world his mother feared. Leo dropped the radio like it burned. "We need to go," he hissed at Wyatt, but it was too late. From somewhere deeper in the tunnels came the echo of boots, fast, organized, voices. Flashlight beams flickered against the tunnel walls. Harvey barked sharply again and turned back toward the fissure in the rock, pawing at it desperately. Grace dropped to her knees beside him and reached into the narrow opening. Her fingers brushed cold stone, then something warm. A hand, thin, trembling, but unmistakably human. "Jack," she sobbed. A raspy voice replied. Grace Nolan holstered his weapon and knelt. "Step aside. I'll open it." He took a crowbar from his belt and wedged it into the loose rock edges. With a grunt, he pried one, then another stone free. Grace scraped with her bare hands, nails breaking, blood mingling with dust, until at last, the gap widened enough for Jack to squeeze through. He looked like a ghost of the man he had once been. His beard was wild and streaked with gray, his cheeks hollowed, but his eyes, those eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, burning with recognition. Grace caught him as he stumbled forward. "I knew you'd find me," he whispered. Harvey jumped up, licking Jack's face, whining. Jack's hand found his fur and gripped tight. "You're the one who brought her." Behind them, footsteps thundered. Armed officers in tactical gear flooded the chamber, FBI emblems visible on their vests. Peter Martinez entered with them, now in full field uniform, years retired but looking as though he'd never left. His face, rugged and lined, cracked into a smile when he saw Grace. "You really don't know how to make a quiet call, do you?" He gestured, and two agents moved to detain Wyatt and Leo. Both offered little resistance. Wyatt muttered something about orders and investors, while Leo cursed under his breath. Peter turned to Grace and Jack. "We've been tracking activity at this site for months, but we needed a clear signal. That whistle, your timing was perfect." Grace looked at Jacob. "Not mine, his." Peter crouched beside the boy. "You did good, son. Real good." Jacob didn't answer, but his shoulders straightened, and for the first time, he didn't flinch when someone touched him. He let Peter ruffle his hair. One agent examined the contents of the lab. "This isn't just geology. This is advanced energy research, proprietary. Someone's been sitting on something big." Jack nodded. I had to keep it hidden. Too many hands wanted to own it. I didn't know who to trust, except Harvey. He kept coming back to the surface. I left him messages, and one day he brought her the jacket. Grace squeezed his hand tighter. He brought you home. The team began cataloging equipment, securing the site. Nolan leaned against the cavern wall, exhaling slowly. Well, he said to no one in particular, I suppose I'll write this one up as just another quiet day in the hills. A year had passed since the mountain gave up its secret and returned Jack Thompson to the world. Granite Bluff had changed with the seasons, spring melting into summer, summer yielding to the burnished gold of autumn. And now winter again, though a gentler one. Snow lined the windowsills of the old green-shuttered house at the edge of town, where laughter now rose softly from within. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and old pine. Grace stood by the stove, stirring a pot of mulled cider, the kind Jack liked on cold afternoons. Her silver-streaked hair was now cut into a soft bob, easier to manage on long walks. There was a lightness in her that hadn't been there before, less caution, more warmth. The lines around her eyes had softened, not from age, but from smiling more often. Jack sat at the long wooden table near the window, sorting through a stack of handwritten notes and geological samples. He was leaner than before, with grayer hair and a quiet steadiness in his every move, though he still walked with a limp, the result of a fall in the caves. He never complained. His days were now divided between rest, research, and the slow, beautiful task of rebuilding a life. And Harvey, sweet, golden Harvey, slept curled by the hearth, his coat glistening with recent grooming, tail occasionally twitching at the sound of footsteps beyond the porch. He had filled out in the past year. No longer the wilderness scout lean dog he had been, but still agile, still alert, at 8 years old. He had become more than a dog. He was a presence, a guardian, a soul in fur and light. The front door creaked. Jacob burst in, cheeks red from the cold, breath pluming from his scarf. He was taller now, nearly up to Grace's shoulders, and his eyes had lost the haunted, inward look they once held. A thick navy coat hugged his frame, and strapped to his back was a canvas sketch pad with worn corners. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," he said, then turned to Harvey. "Hey, boy." Harvey's head lifted, ears perked, and he padded over to nuzzle the boy's hand. The bond between them had deepened into something wordless but essential. Two creatures who had once stood on the edge of fear and learned to trust again. Grace smiled. "You're early. I finished early." Jacob said, "We had art therapy today." I drew the cave again. He pulled a charcoal drawing from his bag, arches of stone glittering with impossible crystals, and in the center, a small golden dog standing guard beside a shaft of light. Jack chuckled from the table. That's exactly how it looked. Jacob beamed, shy but proud. Sarah, Jacob's mother, soon followed, tall and willowy, with hair now longer and streaked with soft grays. She had changed, too. Her once guarded demeanor had warmed. The fear in her eyes had been replaced with gratitude. Losing her husband had built walls in her. But Harvey and the events of that winter had begun to gently pull them down. "I hope he's not intruding," she said, removing her gloves. "Not at all," Grace replied. "This house misses him when he's not around." Jacob had his own mug now. Grace had painted his name on it with mountain silhouettes. He sat cross-legged on the rug beside Harvey, sipping cider while sketching a new picture. A trio, man, woman, dog, standing on a hill beneath a sky full of stars. Jack, watching them. Tapped his pen against a weathered notebook. "You should put that in the book," Grace said. He nodded. Chapter 11. loyalty in the dark. Jack's discovery had shaken more than just the scientific community. The mineral formations he'd documented, crystalline compounds with extraordinary conductive properties, had since revolutionized clean energy storage. The cave, now a protected federal site, was studied by teams from universities across the country. Jack had refused private investors and patents. He wanted it to belong to the people, but for all the accolades and academic invites, Jack only cared about three things: Grace, Harvey, and peace. Harvey still checks the back fence every night. Jacob said as he sketched, like he's making sure we're still safe. He's just doing his rounds. Grace replied, old habits die hard. Peter Martinez visited often, now more friend than detective. The FBI team that had assisted in the rescue remained in touch as well. Jack occasionally gave guest lectures via Zoom, but his favorite audience was Jacob, who asked questions no one else dared. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the frost-tipped pine trees outside, Grace called softly from the door. Time for the walk. It had become tradition. Harvey stood, stretched with a grunt, then trotted to the door. Jacob pulled on his gloves. Jack took his cane and slipped his arm through Grace's. The four of them stepped out into the crisp air, the porch creaking gently under their weight. Granite Bluff shimmered with holiday lights in the distance. The trail behind the house, once cold and empty, now bore footprints side by side. Day after day. Harvey led the way, tail held high. Jacob walked beside him, pointing out frozen mushrooms on fallen logs. Grace and Jack followed, hand in hand, their silence no longer weighted by loss, but by contentment. And though the mountain still stood solemn and secretive, the trail that wound through its woods now bore witness to something rare, a family born not of blood, but of survival, trust, and love. Sometimes. Miracles don't come with thunder or flashes of light. Sometimes. They arrive quietly, on four muddy paws, with a weathered jacket in their mouth and eyes full of knowing. Harvey wasn't just a dog, he was a messenger of hope, a guide sent in the silence, when all seemed lost, just like Jack's journey back from darkness. We all walk through tunnels in life, places where we feel trapped, forgotten, or overwhelmed, but the light is always there, even if faint, and sometimes God sends us unlikely angels, loyal friends, children with brave hearts, or even a dog with golden fur to lead us home. This story is a reminder that faith, loyalty, and love are the most powerful forces we have, that healing takes time, and that even after years of silence, God still listens. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen below if you believe in miracles, in second chances, and in the power of faith. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, and may God bless you and your loved ones, especially the ones still waiting to find their way home.